so that we have this saved and we can go back if need to. I'm going to just real quickly get us started. We've got a PowerPoint that we're going to go through, Jen and I, and then we will share that out with you. So let me get that ready to roll. And you don't want to look at my screen. Here we go. Okay, take it away, Jen.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. We just wanted to again reach out and make sure that everyone knows what we're talking about when you hear about ESSA identifications. Everybody who's been invited to this meeting has received an identification from the Department of Public Instruction. So this should be about a 15-minute conversation. We just want to go over an overview of accountability, discuss the individual school identifications, review resources, and then we have a few ESSA schools who are with us right now. We'll let you know who those are, and we'll just have some additional information for you at the end.
All right. Sorry, there we go.
There we go. Okay, so just to back up, like where these identifications are coming from historically, because we receive ESSA funds, which are now ESSA funds through the Every Student Succeeds Act, we have to have an accountability system basically if we're going to be accepting all the titles. So DPI has a new accountability system because we had the change from ESSA to ESSA. In the past, we were talking about DI-FI and Sci-Fi, and then we had focus and priority schools. So now we've had this shift to ATSI, TSI, and CSI schools. We'll identify those further in the next slide. So accountability is coming from two federal laws, so ESSA and IDEA. IDEA accountability is primarily at the district level. ESSA is at the school level. So that's why, again, we want to make sure that we're all on the same page regarding this. So we are, though, in year 2 of these ESSA identifications, and we don't feel that enough information has gone out to you all, if any information has gone out to you all. The reason for that is because with the focus and priority identifications, DPI went directly to the principals and to the schools and had direct communication, and the district office didn't really have much, wasn't really looped into those conversations as much. DPI really switched it up and now directed everything to the district level and kind of looped out the schools and the principals without communicating that change in communication style to the districts. That combined with all the turnover that we had at district office, it just feels like we lost a little bit in our communication efforts. So everyone is meeting compliance. We are all good. We just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with messaging. All right, so we're going to talk about the types of identifications. And again, this is based on 17-18 data, even though we are in year 2 of these identifications. So there's three ways a school can fall into an identification. The first one is targeted support and improvement. It's always fascinating that DPI is going to use targeted again for something else, not DPI, the feds. When we have targeted assistance, now we have targeted support. So this case, this targeted is because of these identifications.
Jen, can I just
schools.
a second? I want to make sure that people understand that this is different than the state report cards. The state report cards are a rating system. You get a 1 to 5 stars, and it's based on specific scores. The Fed identification is a ranking system. So all schools in the state are lined up top to bottom, the highest score to the lowest score. And then when we talk about the bottom 10% of the state, or TSI, that means they have literally ranked all the schools from top to bottom, and then TSI is in the bottom 10%.
Thanks for that, Tim. So it is very possible that you might have a high score on your report card, but then you fell into an identification, which gets a little tricky when explaining this to your community. So targeted support improvement schools, again, we have 18 of those schools here in Madison. One or more student groups are performing in the bottom 10% of the state. So like Tim said, ranking the schools and then looking at the bottom 10% of performance. These identifications are made annually. We had TSI school last year, I think 1 or 2 who are no longer TSI in year 2. Let's see. And we'll talk a little bit more about requirements for that in the next slide. We then have ATSI schools, so additional targeted support and improvement schools. We have 9 of those. 1 or more student groups that is performing in the bottom 5% of all Title I receiving schools in the state. Tim and I had to really sit down and discuss what this definition meant, because this could be for title schools or non-title schools, but rank order comparing to scores in just the title schools, if that makes sense.
Right, and both TSI and ATSI are talking about any one of the 9 of the groups, demographic groups, or the service provision groups. So students with disabilities, English learners, or economically disadvantaged students. So each one of those categories is what we're talking about for student groups.
Okay, and again, like we did that flipped when we went to focus and priority schools, we're looking at gaps internally between subgroups. So that's important to keep in mind with this identification again. Identifications for ATSI are made every 3 years. So this is something, these schools will not be identified again until year 4. And you're primarily working on improvement processes and procedures in a cohort of schools, because the philosophy is that large change does not happen in 1 year. Okay, our last identification, we do not have any schools in this comprehensive support and improvement. We have schools, I believe, in the Milwaukee School District who fell into this criteria. Overall summary scores in the bottom 5% of all Title I receiving schools across the state. Again, you could be title or non-title, but your school is being compared to Title I receiving school scores. Or graduation rate below 67%. Important to know, the reason why we're putting this up here, even though we don't have schools that are CSI, is because if ATSI schools do not exit within 5 years of their identification, so if they don't exit in that second cycle of identification, they automatically become an CSI school. ATSI schools, we're going to talk to you about that at the end of this conversation. So compliance, this is where we've been really working with people here at Doyle on our new SIP process, because compliance is that there's an identified subgroup in your SIP with evidence-based strategies listed. So we are making sure that when we move to SIP 2.0, that there still is a place and a conversation for your identified subgroups. Primarily, our Black student group was the one that brought many of our schools into these identifications because of our Black excellence work, because of our recognition of our Black student group within our SIP. We're all pretty much meeting compliance. There's just a few schools that had to add a couple things. Basically, students with disabilities, that was maybe the one call out that we didn't see for about 3 schools in their SIP. So DPI reporting, there is technically no DPI reporting for TSI and ATSI schools. You all need to be working on your SIP, status quo, recognizing these identified subgroups or calling them out, and that's about it. We are being required to undergo ESSA monitoring every 3 years. Many of you know about that because you helped me through that last February. That's the time where DPI is going to come in and ask to review SIPs and possibly the work that's being done at 1 or 2 of our ATSI schools. So documentation is going to be very important. Any work that you're doing, and pretty much with our school improvement process out in our schools, we're doing this already. Documenting our meetings, having sign-in sheets, that's proof that you are working for your identified subgroup for improvement purposes. That's what DPI is going to be looking for. We're doing this already.
Right. One of the things that is different for most schools in the state is this continuous improvement plan rubric. We've linked it here, and I'll be sending information to specific schools that need to be looking at specific parts of the rubric. Again, as Jen said, documentation is really going to be critical.
Right. And as far as like what documentation we're talking about, we truly don't know. DPI has written this to be extremely vague so that schools can do what they need to, what they know they need to do for improvement purposes. So whatever you're doing at your school, just keep doing it, because there's been plenty of commenting that Madison School District has such a solid school improvement planning process that we're already meeting requirements here. Okay, so we wanted to make sure that everyone could always find their reporting, because each school receives an ESSA accountability report every year. We want to make that easy for you to find. These reports are released in December of every year. So second round came out in December. These reports are embargoed until March. So the embargo has been lifted. But whether embargoed or not, you need to, as a principal, be able to see where your identifications came from. So the place that Tim and I settled on and kind of made the most sense was where your Title I budget lives. I don't know if Britta is on. Crestwood is not a title school, but we've worked together. She's accessed this report in the past, or this, I totally lost what I was going to say, this folder in the past. Dan, you probably haven't worked here either, but if you go to the U Drive, Department Shared, Title I, we have every school in the district has their own folder in this area. And then you'll be able to find your report in this folder. Let us know if you have trouble, if there's any rights issues. We may have to go to IT to make sure that you can get in. Okay, and then we have some other, Tim, I don't know if you want to go through like the rest of the reports that we have in there. Okay, Tim and I are in different rooms, so I don't know if he heard me or not. So
yes, I did. Okay. So I've created a document called Understanding the ESSA Identifications, and I'm going to share that out right now. It will look something like this. So what you will see is a table, essentially, that has the CSI, TSI, and ATSI identifications. It'll tell you about why you were placed here, how often that this is actually taken care of, the level, the criteria, exit criteria, et cetera. It covers each of the three areas, CSI, TSI, and ATSI. So that is going to be available for you as in your folders right now. Let's see what else we've got. There will be the official DPI Fed documentation. So there are two documents, one that typically is about a 10 or 15 page document that goes through every single criteria, as well as if you are ATSI, it will have progress towards exiting. And finally, I've put a document in each school that is ATSI in your folder that specifically calls out what are some of the things, the criteria that you need to do in order to get to exit that particular title. So I think that's it, right, Jen?
Yep. And again, if you have any trouble accessing that folder, just let Rick or I know right away, and we will get that, get you in today. We'll talk to IT. But if you are a title school, you should definitely have rights. You'll be okay. All right, so we put down some additional resources. There is the link to the DPI page that lists out all these federal identifications, everything we talked about, and just some more specific information for you. There is also a continuous improvement process criteria and rubric. This is a document that lists out exactly what DPI is looking for and when they're in what they're referring to as continuous improvement to meet requirements. If you read it and look at it, you will see that our SIP process that we have here in the district is meeting what DPI is looking for.
Here is a case again of what the document was. It's a link up to the Understanding the Identification document as well.
Yep, Tim created that document, did a great job. It's a really great one-stop resource to understand what we're talking about. So we just wanted to specifically talk right now to Alice, Lakeview, Leopold, and Mendota principals. These are our ATSI schools. We want to talk about exit requirements. Everybody else, we will be here for questions. You're welcome to call or email anytime. thank you so much for bearing with us this morning with our login issues. But hopefully this kind of gives you a little more information on your identification.
Yes, and don't hesitate to email questions, to give me a call, etc. Either one of us.
All right, so I'm going to continue. We just have this one additional slide, but Tim actually is probably going to manage this conversation. Tim's done an amazing job with keeping track of all these identifications. Thank you for that. Tim made some reports or created reports for your 4 schools to list out exactly what you need to be looking for in order to exit this criteria. So Tim, I'll let you take over this slide.
Sure. So essentially for exiting ATSI, there are 3 requirements that you have to have. In one of the criteria in order to be on this list is that you are in the bottom 5% of students. You are below the threshold that the state has set and said, here is the bottom 5%. So you're below that. You need to, this is student performance that we're talking about on the forward and DLM assessments. You need to ensure that the specific group that you've been identified for, and typically I believe this is, all our cases, this is Black students, you need to ensure that their performance is higher than the threshold in the initial year. And since we're comparing to the state threshold for that particular group, every year that bar changes. It may go up, it may go down. Wherever that 5%, 5th percentile is from performance of the Black students in the state, you have to be above that. So obviously you can't be above it in the initial year because you were identified with that, but in the preceding years or in the following years, you need to be above that. In 2017, 2018, I believe it was 6.4% was the number, and in this past year it was 6.7. So that bar will move up or down. You can never be below what you were identified at. You always have to be above that as the minimal, regardless of where the state goes. So that's step 1. Step 2 is you have to show growth over time towards long-term goals. And again, this is for ELA on the forward and math on the forward, as well as the dynamic learning maps. So you have to show growth in your particular group over time. So looking at the first year, where were your Black students as far as points-based proficiency? So how many students were advanced, proficient, basic, and minimal? And then the following year, last year, where were they at? And where are they at this year? You have to show continuous growth. So year 1 has to be the lowest. Year 2 has to be higher than that. Year 3 has to be higher than the previous 2. Finally, the third is evidence that you're putting in place systems that will ensure long-term sustainable improvement. And this is essentially what we're doing with our SIPs. You have to have stakeholder meetings. You have to be listening to families in the community. You have to be sharing leadership, which is what our SBLT structure is at. But the critical piece is you have to document this. You only have to report to the district level at this point. If you are CSI, you have to show all that evidence to the state. We have to sign off as a district that in fact you are showing signs of long-term improvement planning and practices. This is reviewed. You have an option to exit, not an option. You have the ability to exit ATSI after year 3. And these 3 pieces, the threshold, the improvement, and the systems, the structure, all 3 have to be met in order for you to exit ATSI. So if, for instance, you meet the threshold, being above that every year, if you are having your system and structure in place, you've got that all documented, great. But if, for instance, your Black students have not shown the improvement in long-term goals in mathematics, then you have not met the requirements of all three. So it's really the three pieces that we need to focus on before we get into the next cycle. After the third year, so the 4, 5, and 6, if you do not move out of ATSI, then you will be moved into CSI, which means we now need to focus on sharing this information with the state. Mm-hmm. So, Jen, anything else? That kind of is in a nutshell. I put a document sharing this with each of you in your Title I folders, specifically about exiting requirements for your school.
Right. Tim created these exit requirement reports for each of your schools. They explain this all really well, but if you need additional support going through it, again, we're definitely available to help you with that. And then I think that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in on ESSA identifications. I know how exciting that is. And then again, like I said, like we said, if you have any questions, come to us anytime.
Thanks, everyone. And we will have this posted or share out the recording of this for you yet later today.
Hey, Tim, do you still have time for questions?
Absolutely. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording, unless, Jen, you think I should keep it recording?
Why don't we record? Because we're going to have some other schools watch this. Yeah.
Yeah, so go ahead.
I was just checking out Hawthorne's report and that you had in our, U Drive department's title, Hawthorne. And it looked like we were year 2, I think, for special ed, but then I saw year 1 for African American. So I guess I just wanted to clarify. I don't know. I mean, I hear what you guys are saying about, our SIP plans are, identified in Madison as being strong. And of course, I know our SIP plan very much calls out our African-American students and now special ed for focus groups for improvement. I didn't know how, other than that, if I should, how closely we needed to be paying attention to the quote, year 2, year 1. It feels like an obvious question, but I just want to make sure there's not something I'm missing.
No, that's a great question. What you're talking about is TSI, meaning those groups in that particular year were identified in the bottom 10% of the state. And again, that's a moving mark because, again, as people across the state grow and recede, that where that 10% is will change every year. But we're talking about specific student groups. You already recognize that these are the groups that you are struggling with to gain proficiency. I would just continue your work with your SIPs, calling out both of those groups. The rubric, if the continuous improvement rubric that is available from DPI, if you want some specifics, that what they're asking for, it's nothing that you have to do, but we can certainly share that with you.
Right. And keep in mind, because TSI is an annual identification, like Tim said, it's very possible you might be in year 1 for one subgroup, year 2 for another. That's just going to happen as our mobility changes, as our proficiency changes across the state. So it's a little confusing, but definitely possible.
Okay. And then I kind of caught a little bit on the first before I logged out thinking I was done, and then I was looking at my report and I was like, oh, I have a question. So I logged back in. It sounds like though it can continue on into the next round of 3 years. So if I have a group, Hawthorne has a group that is year 1, and then next year is the 3rd year, then when it would otherwise be the 4th year, or it's a new round of 3 years.
So that's for the ATSI schools. Right now, you're a TSI school. So you're on these subgroups are being identified on an annual basis at Hawthorne.
Okay.
So the identification of ATSI and CSI happens once every 3 years. So in between that, you cannot be Even though you are below that threshold, if it's not an identification year, you cannot be identified.
Okay.
So no additional ATSI schools until year 4, basically.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then when year 4 happens, is it a new cut or does it dip back into the prior 3 years?
It's going to be a new cut. It's going to be based on that ranking system from bottom to top in that particular year.
Got it. Duh. Okay.
No, that's a great
Good
question.
questions. Yeah.
Any others?
Okay. We're seeing that Leopold needs access to the U Drive, and we'll make that happen today.
And Sarah Cutler, the question about is the summary score, the percentile lower than 5? It's the points-based proficiency summary score for that particular group that is less than the 5th percentile of the state.
So can I just, I'm trying to read the report and wanting to make sure I understand it.
Mhm.
So the ELI points-based proficiency at Alice for 17-18 was 15.1,
Mhm.
and then 18-19 was 21. Our identification summary score is 3.6. Maybe this is maybe an offline conversation just to help me understand how that is calculated and where those numbers are coming from.
Yeah, it's a long conversation, a good 10-minute conversation, I
Yeah.
think. We
Okay.
can connect with you.
Great.
Anyone else? And yes, we will be happy to have that conversation with everyone and anyone who has questions about, even if you're not TSI, what that looks like and how it's calculated. So be more than happy to have that conversation. Okay, then I'm going to stop recording and we will